Have you ever looked in the mirror and felt like time is moving faster than it should? Not just the wrinkles or the gray hairs, but that feeling that your body no longer responds the way it used to, that your energy is running low, that something is changing, and you can't quite put your finger on what it is. Most people assume this is inevitable, that aging that way is simply the price you pay for the years you've lived. But what few people know is that most of the time, it isn't time itself that's responsible for that wear and tear. It's habits, small daily choices that repeat day after day without us paying attention, and that over time silently and deeply accelerate aging. Habits we've normalized to the point where we no longer see them as a problem, but simply as part of the landscape. Today, we're going to talk about those 7 habits that are making you age faster without you even realizing it. Not from a place of fear or guilt, but from the kind of wisdom the Stoics and other great thinkers passed down to us, people who understood something fundamental, that the way we live each day is, in large part, the most important choice we can make. Because aging is inevitable, but how we age, that's up to you. Let's begin. The first of these habits is one of the most widespread, and also one of the most overlooked. It has to do with something you do, or fail to do, every night. Something that many people over 60 repeat almost with resignation. I just don't sleep like I used to. They say it the way you'd accept that the sky is blue, or that winter brings cold. They take it as an unchangeable truth, a logical consequence of age that has no solution and doesn't deserve too much attention. And right there, in that quiet acceptance, lies the problem. Sleeping poorly is not a sign that you're getting older. It's one of the reasons you're aging faster. While you sleep, your body does work it simply cannot do at any other point in the day. It repairs tissue, consolidates memory, regulates hormones, and clears out the toxins that build up in the brain throughout the day. In the most literal sense of the word, it is the moment when your body restores itself. When that process is interrupted night after night, the decline accelerates at a pace that no cream, no supplement, and no daytime habit can fully make up for. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that every dawn is a new opportunity to begin. But for that beginning to have real strength, it needs to be preceded by genuine rest. A beginning built on broken nights is a fragile one. Science backs this up with a clarity that leaves little room for doubt. Research from the University of California has shown that chronic sleep deprivation accelerates cellular aging, weakens the immune system, and significantly increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cognitive decline. In other words, sleeping poorly doesn't just make you feel tired the next day, it ages you from the inside out. But the most striking thing isn't that this happens, it's that it happens while most people do nothing about it, because they've accepted the idea that it's normal. And when something becomes normal, it stops being seen as a problem that can be solved. Epictetus said that the first step toward freedom is recognizing what is within our control. And while we can't control everything that happens while we sleep, we can control the conditions we set up for rest. The time we turn off our screens, the temperature of the room, the quality of the silence we cultivate before lying down, the ritual we build to signal to our body that it's time to let the day go. Maybe it's not about sleeping the same number of hours you did at 30, but it is about respecting sleep for what it truly is. Not a luxury, not wasted time, but the quiet foundation on which everything else rests. Your energy, your mood, your mental clarity, your vitality. It all starts there. So if you've been telling yourself that sleeping poorly is just the way things are, I'd invite you to question that story. Because more often than not, what we accept as inevitable is simply something we haven't yet given the attention it deserves. Now, if sleep is the foundation from which the body restores itself from within, there's another habit that wears it down from the outside, and just as quietly, one that's rooted in something that seems completely reasonable, even sensible. We're talking about the fear of moving. Fear is one of the most powerful forces there is. It can protect you from real danger, but it can also trap you in a so-called safe zone that over time becomes a cage. And there's one very specific fear that tends to show up with age, one that's rarely named directly, but is always there, working in silence: the fear of moving. It's not an irrational fear. It comes from something real. A fall you witnessed up close, a pain that took too long to go away, a doctor who said, "Be careful," a body that no longer responds the way it used to. And from that place of reasonable caution, many people start doing less and less. They stop walking long distances, avoid stairs, give up the exercise they used to do, sit more and move less, all with the best intentions in the world, not to get hurt. But here's the paradox that most people never see coming. The human body doesn't stay healthy by resting. It stays healthy by moving. When you stop using your muscles, they weaken. When you stop bearing weight, your bones lose density. When you stop moving, circulation slows, joints stiffen, balance deteriorates. And the very risk of getting hurt, the one you were trying to avoid, becomes far more real. Seneca put it with a precision that still holds true 20 centuries later. It's not that we have so little time, but that we waste so much of it. And one of the quietest ways to waste time and life is to stay still when the body still has the capacity to move. Think of a tree that grows in a sheltered spot, with no wind, no resistance. Its roots never learn to grow deep because they've never had to. Now think of a tree that grew exposed to storms. Its roots go deeper, its trunk is thicker, its structure is stronger. The human body works in a similar way. It needs the stimulus of movement to stay strong. This isn't about running marathons or lifting weights like you're 30 years old. It's about learning to tell the difference between pain that signals danger and the discomfort that simply comes with reclaiming your vitality. About walking a little farther each day, stretching in the morning, taking the stairs when you can, choosing intentional movement over indefinite rest. Psychologist Ellen Langer conducted a study that became a landmark in the psychology of aging. She took a group of older men, placed them in an environment that evoked how they had lived 20 years earlier, and asked them to behave as if they really were those younger versions of themselves. Within a week, their posture had improved, their strength had increased, and their memory was sharper. The body responded because it was given permission to do so. That permission is exactly what fear takes away. And Stoic wisdom, at its core, is built on the ability to distinguish what depends on you from what doesn't. Movement, within the real limits of your abilities, depends on you, and so does fear. We've talked about what happens while you sleep, and what happens while you move or stop moving. Now comes a third habit that plays out several times a day, every single day, and precisely because of how often it happens, it becomes invisible. It's something so ordinary, it barely seems worth noticing. Or at least, that's what we tell ourselves. There's a scene that plays out in millions of homes. You wake up and make the same thing you always do because it's quick and familiar. At noon, you eat whatever's around or whatever takes the least time to prepare. In the evening, something light, because I'm not even hungry at this hour. And just like that, without much thought, without questioning it, without noticing that you've been repeating the exact same pattern for months or years. That's eating on autopilot. And it's one of the habits that ages the body most, precisely because it doesn't look dangerous. There are no obvious excesses, no glaring mistakes, just a routine that's become so automatic it's no longer a conscious choice. It's just something that happens. The problem isn't always what you eat. Often, it's the lack of awareness with which you eat it. Eating quickly, standing up, in front of a screen, while your mind is somewhere else entirely. Repeating the same foods without stopping to ask whether they're actually giving your body what it needs at this stage of life. Skipping a meal because you're not hungry, without noticing that a lack of interest in food can itself be a signal worth paying attention to. Marcus Aurelius wrote that an unexamined life is not worth living. And while he was talking about examining the soul and one's character, that principle applies just as much to our most everyday acts, including what we put on our plates. At 60, the body has different needs than it did decades earlier. It needs more protein to maintain muscle mass, which naturally tends to decrease with age. It needs more calcium, more vitamin D, more fiber. It needs hydration that often doesn't happen because the sensation of thirst diminishes with age. And if you don't feel thirsty, you don't drink. And if you don't drink, the body runs in a state of chronic dehydration that affects energy, focus, and joint health. The philosopher and physician Hippocrates said to let food be your medicine. He didn't mean it as a slogan. He meant it as a deep understanding that what enters the body builds or breaks down, sustains or depletes, depending on the choices we make every time we sit down to eat. But there's something even more subtle at work here. Eating on autopilot doesn't just affect your nutrition, it affects your relationship with yourself. When you pay attention to what you eat, when you prepare it with care, when you sit down to enjoy it without distractions, you're sending a powerful message to your own system that it deserves attention, that it matters, that it's worth taking care of. This isn't about following a complicated diet or giving up the foods you love. It's about looking at what you eat with fresh eyes, about asking yourself, even just once a day, is this nourishing me or is it just filling me up? The body ages because of what it eats, how it sleeps, how much it moves. But there's a fourth factor that works at an even deeper level, one you can't see, but that the body feels just as intensely as cold or hunger. It's what happens inside your head when the day winds down, or when you have a moment of quiet, or when something in the present brings back something from the past. It's the habit of rumination, of returning over and over again to what can no longer be changed. I'm not talking about remembering. Remembering is human, it's natural, and often it's beautiful. I'm talking about something different. That mental loop where you take a mistake, a loss, a decision that went wrong, and you start turning it over. Once, again, and again. As if at some point, after enough repetitions, the story might finally end differently. Seneca saw this with a clarity that is still devastatingly accurate. Two things make us suffer: the memory of the past and the fear of the future. Both are a loss of the present moment. And what Seneca understood, modern science confirms. Chronic rumination, that habit of mentally replaying painful situations without ever reaching any resolution, is linked to elevated levels of cortisol, the stress hormone. And chronic stress, sustained over time, accelerates cellular aging in a way researchers have been able to measure directly in the telomeres, the structures that protect our genetic material and that shorten with each cycle of prolonged stress. In other words, rumination doesn't just make you feel bad. It literally ages you from the inside. There's an image I find powerful for understanding this. Imagine that every ruminating thought is a stone you carry in a backpack. At first, one stone seems manageable, but you've been collecting stones for years, never setting any of them down. And now that backpack is so heavy that walking has become an enormous effort. Not because the road is hard, but because you're carrying too much. Epictetus said, "It's not events that disturb us, but the opinions we hold about them." And there's something deeply liberating in that idea, because it means the past, on its own, has no power to hurt you today. What holds that power is the story you keep telling yourself about it, the interpretation you repeat, the judgment you never quite close. This doesn't mean ignoring what you've been through or pretending the pain didn't exist. It means learning to tell the difference between reflecting with purpose and spinning in circles without direction. Reflection leads somewhere, to understanding, to a decision, to peace. Rumination, on the other hand, is a loop that goes nowhere, only inward, and only toward exhaustion. If you find yourself returning to the same thought for the 10th time, that's the signal. Not that the subject is important, but that you're no longer processing it. You're living inside it. And living inside a painful memory is not the same as learning from it. The present, with everything it holds, with everything it still has to offer, is waiting for you. But you can only truly inhabit it when you stop living in another time. If rumination is the habit that pulls you away from the present and inward, the 5th habit pulls you away from the present and outward. Or more precisely, it pulls you away from other people. And like the one before it, it rarely happens all at once. It happens in small steps that, taken one by one, each seem completely reasonable. First, you stop calling someone because you're tired. Then you turn down an invitation because you're just not feeling up to it. Then you start preferring to stay home, where everything is familiar and there's no social effort required. And one day, without having quite decided it, you realize it's been weeks since you had a real conversation with anyone. Not a surface-level exchange, but one of those where you actually feel seen and heard. Social isolation is one of the factors most clearly linked to accelerated aging, and yet it's one of the least taken seriously. Maybe because it doesn't hurt in an obvious way. It's not like a pain in your knee or a sleepless night. It's quieter than that. It settles in like a fog that slowly drains the color from life without you ever quite noticing when it started. The Harvard researcher on longevity and director of the renowned Harvard Study of Adult Development spent decades tracking which factors best predict well-being in old age. The conclusion was definitive. It's not wealth, not success, not physical health on its own. It's relationships. The quality of the human connections we keep alive throughout our lives is the single most powerful predictor of how long and how well we age. Marcus Aurelius, who governed an empire and had every reason in the world to isolate himself behind his position of power, wrote constantly about the social nature of human beings. "We are made to cooperate," he said, "like the feet, the hands, the eyelids, the rows of teeth. Not as separate pieces, but as parts of something that only works together." And yet isolation has its own logic that makes it hard to fight. Because the more time you spend alone, the more comfortable solitude becomes, and the more uncomfortable social contact starts to feel. It's a self-reinforcing loop. Loneliness breeds more loneliness. And the body, meanwhile, receives that signal of isolation and responds to it the way it would respond to a threat, with inflammation, with stress, with an immune system running on permanent high alert. There's something that Richard, a neighbor I remember quite clearly, taught me without ever meaning to. After losing his wife, he gradually closed every door around him. Not out of bitterness or pride, but out of fear of being a burden, of having nothing to contribute, of feeling out of place. One day, I convinced him to come out, and after an hour of simple conversation, nothing extraordinary, his eyes had a light in them I hadn't seen in months. He didn't need big gatherings or great efforts. He needed presence. He needed to feel that he was still part of something. That's what isolation takes from you. Not just company, it takes away the feeling of belonging. And without that feeling, something essential goes dark. You don't have to fill your calendar or become someone you're not. But it is worth asking yourself, when was the last time you chose connection over the comfort of withdrawing? Because sometimes the smallest gesture, a phone call, a cup of coffee, a walk with someone, is exactly what both your body and your soul have been needing. Now it's time to look at a pattern that shows up in many people who've spent decades being the strong one for everyone else. A pattern that was once a survival tool and that over the years becomes an invisible weight. It's the habit of keeping what you feel locked inside, of not talking about what hurts, of pushing forward as if everything's fine, because there's no point in complaining, or because there are people who have it worse, or because you learned early on that emotions are something you handle privately, if you handle them at all. Ignoring negative emotions looks, on the surface, like a form of strength. But what actually happens is that those emotions don't go away, they accumulate, and a body that carries unprocessed emotions for months, for years, for decades, finds a way to express them one way or another. Sometimes as chronic muscle tension, sometimes as digestive problems no doctor can quite explain, sometimes as a tiredness that rest doesn't touch, or as an irritability that surfaces for no apparent reason. Physician and author Gabor Mate has devoted much of his career to studying the connection between suppressed emotions and physical illness. His conclusion, backed by decades of clinical research, is that the body keeps track of everything the mind decides not to process. It doesn't forget, it stores it, and that storage carries a real biological cost. The Stoics, interestingly, did not preach the suppression of emotions. That's a common misconception. What they taught was something far more nuanced. Recognize what you feel, examine it honestly, and then choose how to respond. Not repress, not pretend. Recognize and choose. Epictetus said that the wise person is not the one who feels nothing, but the one who is not swept away by what they feel. And that distinction matters, because feeling sadness, anger, fear, or frustration is not the problem. The problem is when those emotions go unnamed, without space, without any outlet, and start moving through the body looking for a way to express themselves regardless. Think of a pot with the lid on and the heat turned up. If you don't open the valve, the pressure builds, not because steam is harmful, but because it has nowhere to go. Emotions work in a similar way. They don't need to disappear. They need to move, to be transformed, to be acknowledged by someone, even if that someone is you. This can be as simple as sitting with what you feel for a few minutes without trying to change it. Writing what's on your mind in a journal with no filter and no editing. Talking it through with someone you trust. Or simply naming it quietly. I'm sad. I'm angry. This hurts. That act of naming, which seems small, has a concrete effect on the nervous system. What has a name has a shape, and what has a shape can be held and eventually released. This isn't about spending your life analyzing every emotion or turning your inner world into a full-time project. It's about not treating what you feel like something to be hidden, because what gets hidden doesn't disappear, and the body, unlike the mind, doesn't know how to pretend. We've arrived at the last of these 7 habits. And in some ways, it's the most subtle of all, because it comes disguised as something that can look a lot like wisdom. It's that conviction, sometimes never even put into words, that by this point in life, you've learned enough, that new things are for younger people, that the way things have always been is more than sufficient, that changing now, at this age, doesn't really make much sense. It's a habit that doesn't hurt right away, but over time, it dims something essential. Neuroscientist Norman Doidge, through his work on brain plasticity, demonstrated something that changed the way we understand how the brain ages. The brain doesn't stop being moldable with age. It remains capable of forming new connections, of learning, of adapting, as long as it's given the stimulus to do so. But when that stimulus stops coming, when the days become completely predictable, and there's nothing new to process, the brain begins to lose that plasticity, not because it's old, but because it's not being used that way. Marcus Aurelius, who governed the most powerful empire of his time, kept writing in his personal journals about what he could still learn, what he could still improve, where he was still growing. Not from a place of dissatisfaction, but from a genuine curiosity he never saw as incompatible with age or with the wisdom he'd accumulated. For him, to stop learning was to stop living fully. And there's something else that happens when we close our minds to what's new. It's not just that the brain loses its sharpness. Relationships suffer too. Because when we stop being open to different perspectives, to ideas we haven't encountered, to ways of seeing the world that aren't our own, we start relating only to what we already know. And what we already know, as valuable as it is, cannot be all that life still has to offer. I remember a comment from a listener named Margaret, who was 72 and had spent a long time telling herself that technology, new activities, anything that meant stepping outside her familiar routine simply wasn't for her. One day she decided to learn to use the phone her daughter had given her months earlier, which she had barely touched. She started slowly, patiently, without putting too much pressure on herself. And something curious happened. She didn't just learn how to use it. She discovered she was still capable of learning, that her brain still responded, still lit up when faced with something new. That experience, as she later shared, gave her back something she hadn't known she'd lost, the feeling of being alive in an active way, not just getting by. Learning something new doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be technology or a foreign language or anything outside your comfort zone. It can be a book on a topic you've never explored, a conversation where you genuinely listen instead of waiting for your turn to talk, a different route on your usual walk, a question you ask with real curiosity instead of assuming you already know the answer. Epictetus said that education doesn't end with school, but with life. And he was right, though perhaps not in the way we usually take it. It's not just about accumulating knowledge. It's about keeping alive that openness to being surprised, to not having everything figured out, to letting life still teach you something. Because the day you believe you already know everything you need to know is the day you truly start to age. We've walked through 7 habits today that age you without warning. None of them is dramatic on its own. None of them is easy to spot from the inside. And that is precisely what makes them so powerful. They don't arrive as major crises, but as small daily choices that quietly stack up until they shape a whole way of living. Sleeping poorly and accepting it as normal, stopping movement out of fear, eating without awareness, living with your eyes on the past, gradually pulling away from others, keeping what you feel locked inside with no way out, closing your mind to what might still surprise you. Each of these habits, alone or in combination, takes something away from the body, the mind, and the spirit. But not one of them is irreversible. And that is the most important thing I'd like you to take away from this video. The Stoics did not teach resignation. They taught discernment, the ability to see things as they are, to recognize what is within your control, and to act from there. Not tomorrow, not when the circumstances are perfect. Today, with what you have, from where you are. At 60, at 70, at any age, there is always a step you can take. There is always a habit you can revisit. There is always a small decision that, repeated with consistency, changes the course of what's ahead. Not because you're a different person, but because you are exactly who you are, and that is more than enough of a starting point. My name is Gabriel, and if this is your first time here, I invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming. And if you've made it this far, you know this isn't just a video about habits. It's an invitation to keep choosing yourself. To find out who stayed until the end, I'd love for you to leave the phrase, "I choose to keep growing," in the comments, and tell me which country you're watching from. I'd love to read your messages and know where you're joining me from on this journey. If you think someone in your life needs to hear any of these ideas, share the video. Sometimes a single reflection at just the right moment can change the course of someone's day. See you in the next one.